Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to tonight's event. My name is Joe. I'm from the not-for-profit social enterprise called Opus Independence that is based here in Sheffield. We've been running the Festival of Debate since 2015. And the Festival of Debate is an open platform for people to come together to discuss the key social, political and environmental issues of the day. You can visit our full lineup on www.festivalofdebate.com if you're interested in hearing about some of the other future events we've got coming up. We've also got Gloria Steinem late this evening. We've got other people like George Monbiot as well coming on the 23rd of June. I'm very pleased to introduce our tonight's event, working with Hope for the Future. And I'd like to please welcome Alice Potter, who's going to tell you a little bit more about tonight's event. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's event, Are There Reasons to be Hopeful in a Climate Crisis? I'm part of the events team at Hope for the Future, and before I hand over to our wonderful host, Sarah, I'm just going to run through some quick housekeeping. So this webinar will be recorded, so it'll be available on demand for you to watch again and share. We'll be sending all our attendees a follow-up email tomorrow with the link to this recording and directing you to Hope for the Future's latest resources. We'll be doing our absolute best to stick to time tonight, and we're scheduled to finish the event at 7 p.m. So finally, I'd just like to ask that everyone be respectful of all the contributions given in today's event from both our speakers and your attendees in the chat. So now I'll hand over to Sarah, and I hope you all enjoy tonight's event.
Hi everyone, thank you Alice, and yeah, welcome to tonight's event. It's fantastic to have you all here. You may have noticed that you can see our speakers this evening, but not the other attendees, so it would be fantastic if you would all maybe introduce yourselves in the chat, and if you just check the box above the chat box and make sure it says everyone else should be able to see your messages, so perhaps you could all just pop in the chat maybe your name and where in the UK, well I presume in the UK, you're dialing in from today. But it's wonderful to have you all here. So as Alice says, I'm Sarah and I'm the Director of Hope for the Future who's hosting this evening's event along with Festival of Debate. I'm dialing in from Sheffield, which is also where the Festival of Debate is based as well. So it's great to be here. For those of you who don't know Hope for the Future, we're a climate communications charity working to equip communities, groups and individuals across the country to communicate the urgency of climate change with their local politicians. We're delighted to be hosting this event as part of the Festival of Debate, and as I say, particularly because our head office is in Sheffield, which is also where the Festival of Debate is also based. This week is also our Big Give campaign week, and we're raising funds through donations to support more people to bring strong actions to their politicians on local and national climate policy. So as part of the Big Give, everything that is donated will be doubled. So, £1 becomes £2, £5 becomes £10. And that means that all donations will have twice the impact. So my colleague Alice is going to share a link in the chat if you'd like to find out more about that and how you might be able to support us and donate. So this evening, we are here to ask the question, are there reasons to be hopeful in a climate crisis? I think with the enormity of everything that is going on in the world right now, it can be difficult to remain hopeful at times. I think sometimes in the face of enormous crises like climate change, talking about hope can sometimes feel maybe a bit futile or naive. But as you may have guessed, at Hope for the Future, we're big fans of hope. But that's not the kind of hope where you just sit around and wait for the best to happen and for something good to happen. We're talking about active hope, and that's a belief in the possibility of a better future that demands that we take action. And that's the kind of hope that we'll be talking about this evening. So to help us answer this question, are there reasons to remain hopeful in a climate crisis? We are joined by three brilliant speakers who are going to answer some of your pre-submitted questions through the evening. So again, it's great, just having a look at the chat, great to see all of you introducing yourselves. Quite a lot of people from Sheffield, which is fantastic. Someone from Germany. I apologise for my earlier comment about being in the UK. Oxford, Denmark, USA. Oh, amazing. It's just fantastic to have you all here this evening. And now I would like to introduce our fantastic three speakers for the evening, and I'll invite them to turn on their cameras, and I'll introduce each of them. So first of all, we've got Lola Fayokun, who is an activist in the youth climate movement. So Lola started campaigning in the UK Student Climate Network, the grassroots organisation which hosted the youth climate strikes in the UK. Lola studies politics in London, and her current focus is on campus justice organising at her university. So a very warm welcome to Lola. Joe Tetlow joined Green Alliance in April 2021 as Senior Political Advisor. He also runs the Environment APPG. Joe previously worked as a Senior Parliamentary Assistant to Neil Parish MP, Chair of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee. In Parliament, Joe helped Neil Parish to campaign for higher environmental standards, including cleaner air, and to amend the agriculture and trade bills to protect standards in trade deals. Welcome, Joe. And last but absolutely not least, we've got Dr. Susie Wang, who has a background in environmental and social psychology and has published a range of academic papers and reports on climate change communication, imagery, and behavioural economics. She's played a key role in climate outreach programmes such as Britain Talks Climate, the UNEP Emissions Gap Report in 2020, and Climate Visuals. So I'm sure you'll all agree we've got some brilliant people here to help us think about this question. So it's fantastic to have you all here, and we're really looking forward to getting stuck into the questions that the audience have been submitting as they signed up to the event over the last couple of weeks. So we won't be taking questions directly from the chat today, mainly just due to time, but please do still put any comments, questions, anything you like in the chat box to get the conversation going. You might find that some of your fellow attendees might answer your questions or might ask really interesting ones that give you some food for thought. So yeah, please do continue to use the chat over the next hour. That would be fantastic. So before we get stuck into the questions, we're actually going to come to you in the audience with a question for you to kind of set the scene for the evening. So Alice is going to share a link in the chat box, which she's just done. So what you need to do is click on that link, and we've got a question, which is, what feelings do you have when you think about climate change? And this question should come up when you click on the link, and there'll be a little box, and then you can just type in there maybe a word, maybe a couple of words to answer that question. So yeah, what feelings do you have when you think about climate change? And I believe Alice is going to share her screen so that we can all see the question, the words and the answers that are coming through as they come through. Great, and Alice has just said, if you can't access the link, you can go to the website there in the message and use that code. So hopefully you've all got access to that. And you can enter up to 3 words, I believe. Oh, Alice, it looks like it says voting is closed and the presenter needs to open voting. Okay, I think that's working now. So hopefully you should be able to type in. Oh gosh, we've got loads. Fantastic. So worried, frustration, despair, anxious, anger, concerned. So quite a lot of, yeah, negative worries, overwhelm, urgency. I can see why you're all here. Tired, paralysis. And I think that the words that come up bigger have been put in more than once. We do have a motivated in there, which is great. Concerned, sad. Yeah. I think that one says, sorry, it's really small on my screen. I think there's one that says faith, which is quite a positive one. Disappointment, lust, yeah. Guilty, yeah. These are all really strong feelings and strong words. Thank you so much for all being really honest and sharing them. And yeah, as I say, obviously this evening we're thinking about how we can be hopeful, or are there reasons to be feeling hopeful? And as I said at the start, I think that's very much about not just thinking, oh, it's all going to be fine, we can just sit back, but actually hope that drives us to action and to make change. So without further ado, I'm gonna kick us off with a starter question for our panelists, and it's a similar kind of question to what we've just been asking the audience. So if you could maybe each of you say in around just a couple of minutes, when you think about climate change, what is your overriding feeling and why? So maybe, I don't know who wants to kick us off. Lola, maybe I could go to you first.
Thank you. Sorry if there's noise if someone walks in. We'll just have to hope that doesn't happen. I think my overriding feeling, I can relate to a lot of the words that were coming up for all of you guys when you were writing in the poll. But I think one of the overriding ones that I can really relate to is a feeling of anger. I think for me, it's what, at least the reason why I started in the climate movement, as you're saying, when I joined the climate strikes, I felt a lot of anger and frustration and confusion about why things were able to be the way that they were. And I think that led me to a place where I was very overwhelmed, which is something which also came up in the poll for a lot of you guys, because it felt like this was such a big issue. How can one person deal with it? Who and like what role can I play within any of this? But ultimately, I feel like that, for me at least, that feeling of overwhelm now has kind of shifted in terms of how I kind of feel that. So honestly, I feel like, and I think that it does have some kind of positive element in it, because what I think about when I think about the climate crisis is the depth and the scale of this issue forces us to really confront all of the ways of thinking and living that we've constructed. And while that can be overwhelming, it also feels like a massive point of opportunity. And using this as the issue that really puts everything else into perspective, and can create the space for us to start, for us to construct more positive ways of living and choosing to relate to each other. So that's how that's where it leaves me and where I've ended up. And that does lead me to a lot of hope. And I think the reason I'm able to have so much hope is because, as we're kind of saying, hope isn't something that you can I don't think you can just cultivate hope on your own. I feel like hope comes from action, from understanding that this is something that none of us are trying to do alone, and so that's not even something that we should, that's not even the way that it's positive to think. This is something that is going to take all of us working together to do the work that needs to be done to create something which is new, and to hold those who are allowing the system to propagate to account. So yeah.
That's fantastic, Lola. Thank you so much, and great to hear how your kind of journey, I suppose, from those feelings of overwhelm and anger and frustration, but through collaboration with other people, or being with other people, I suppose, has led to those feelings of hope. That's fantastic. Joe, perhaps we could come to you next.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Sarah and Lola. That was really good to hear all of that, and also to see what people's reflections were on the slideshow, because I was smiling quite a lot when it came up, because frustration, when it was asked prior to this event, was the overriding feeling that I felt and would like to talk about this evening. And obviously other emotions did come to the fore, such as anxiety and demotivation sometimes, when you see everything that's going on. But I think frustration is probably where I'm at, and as someone who's privileged enough to work in politics, in the environmental space, it's working on this stuff day to day, and we know a lot of the answers, and it's about getting that change adopted by businesses and by governments, by parliamentarians, and really communicating it. And you feel the responsibility in our line of work. I'm quite frustrated if sometimes the things that we know to be correct aren't being listened to, and we feel the pressure of people out there who are sort of anxious and not in the same position that we are, being able to affect change in Parliament and government in Westminster. We feel that responsibility, I think. So frustration for sure. And I think particularly at this moment in time, sort of after COP26 and the net zero strategy being published as well, there's been a little bit of pushback, and I'm very frustrated at that as well, because we felt like we were getting somewhere in terms of consensus, particularly in the UK. And I work on the all-party parliamentary group for the environment, which is a cross-party consensus building group in Parliament. And it's great to see the sort of whole range of parliamentarians from the Conservative Party, Green Party, Labour Party, SNP, everyone from all corners of the nation getting involved in promoting ambitious action in Parliament on the environment. But there are still too many people who feel like they don't want to get on board with this agenda. And I feel like I'm very frustrated about some of the arguments that are being put forward by skeptics still in this day and age, even though the science is so clear. So that's definitely where my frustration comes from. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing what other people say this evening.
Great, thanks, Joe. Yeah, absolutely. Frustration with, people who just aren't listening, and the people who actually have the power to make change. For sure, that is a huge one. How about you, Susie?
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, it's great to be on this panel this evening. I have to, I think, agree with both Lola and Joe. I'm going to talk about multiple emotions. I think coming from a research background, sometimes you feel like you can't have emotions about your work, because you have to be objective and you have to study it and look at it as a scientific object. But we're human, and having emotions is part of that. As I said, I don't really have a single overriding emotion. It sort of changes from day to day, from moment to moment. So sometimes it's worry and sadness, sometimes it's frustration as well. But I also have sort of this overriding sense of hope that, as Lola was saying, as a collective, we're going somewhere and we can achieve more than it sometimes feels like we can. I guess some examples of moments when I've felt these emotions. I remember this was a few years back now, but it's stuck with me. I was working together with one of my colleagues on some work that she was leading in North Africa and the Levant. And it was, in this case, reading transcripts from fisherfolk in Tunisia who had sort of gathered to talk about climate change. And I remember it felt sort of surreal reading this transcript, because I've never met these people, and I've never been to this country, but I was reading about how these fisherfolk were talking about how the fish had changed in the area, the numbers had declined, and their sense of sort of worry, but also frustration because the people around them didn't believe them, you know? So it was simultaneously a feeling of sadness, of course, but also kind of awe. You know, there are so many experiences of climate change from around the world, and it's so important that we listen and we share and sort of convey these stories. And I guess in terms of hope, well, this morning, Climate Outreach, we released a piece of work in the UK, looking at how various groups in the UK feel about net zero and fairness, which has been sort of very central to the issue in the UK recently. And I felt hopeful from this because, I mean, one of the takeaways is that despite still being in a pandemic, despite sort of rising cost of living pressures and energy prices and wars, climate change concern is still up there. People still want action, and people are still concerned. They still want their governments to do things to sort of, as Joe was saying, act on climate change, and that is a big reason for hope, I think.
Great, thank you so much, Susie. Yeah, I think what you're saying about stories is so true. Stories are just so powerful, and you know, yeah, as you say, the kind of public will is there and the mandate is there, and that just needs to translate into action. So we're going to move into our kind of time for questions, and the first topic we're kind of thinking about is we're just going to have a bit of a status check of where we are on kind of climate action, and you know where we're up to. You know, what have the big wins been so far? How fast are we making progress? What needs to happen next? And we've got an audience question that I'll share with you that's kind of around this topic. So, to what extent does positive messaging about climate change misrepresent where we are in the grand scheme of tackling this crisis? Aren't we way behind where we're meant to be? And just a note to say, we have got a question a bit later on the use of positive messaging in furthering climate action. So this is more about the kind of is it kind of misrepresenting where we are? So where are we? Would you say in kind of how are we doing in tackling climate change so far? So perhaps Joe, I could come to you first on that.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And yeah, in terms of where we are, I mean, the other thing that I didn't mention was hope, of course, in the feelings about where we are, which obviously hope for the future. You know, we've definitely got to be hopeful alongside that frustration. So yeah, in terms of where we are, I think in the UK we're in a better position than a lot of countries, or we've come a long way. But I think in terms of hope and where to look, I was actually just looking at the sort of global net zero tracker the other day, and actually that is a cause for optimism and a cause for hope, because just a sort of quick glance at that shows that 90% of global GDP is covered by net zero commitments, 88% of global emissions, and 85% of the global population. So they're just targets, and a lot of that's happened quite recently. Of course, the next stage is implementation and actually how we're going to get there, and that's a lot harder. But I think just in terms of that first step, in terms of like countries now getting on board with the net zero agenda, whether it's 2040 or 2050 or even as late as 2070, I think we are making those first steps of progress towards, you know, the globe reducing carbon emissions, which is obviously incredibly important. So definitely hopeful about that. And yeah, I think there are obviously, I think one thing I'd say, particularly from a UK perspective, is that we've actually managed to grow the economy whilst cutting emissions. So when we're talking about emotions and climate alarmism and doom and gloom, a lot of our opponents out there like to talk about things, like to try and paint the picture of, you know, net zero by 2050 as an example of as being, you know, they say colder and poorer. And I like to sort of say, turn it around and say, actually, we're going to be warmer and richer, and actually just try and paint that positive view and that positive picture of what a sort of sustainable future is going to look like. And I think in terms of messaging and communication, I think it's quite helpful for us to be talking about what the future looks like in a sort of reassuring way, but also in a way that people can understand, so it doesn't seem so difficult and foreign or costly to them. And it's actually a positive picture and something that's relatable and achievable. So yeah, in terms of communications, particularly with MPs in my experience, I feel like that's a good place to start. And it is reassuring when you look at the net zero tracker to actually go, hang on, we've actually made quite a lot of progress. We can bank that. Now that's a motivator to kind of move on. What are the next things that we need to do?
Great, thanks, Joe. Susie or Lola, do either of you want to come in on kind of the status that we're at, where we're up to in our kind of climate action? Susie?
Yeah, sure. I can go first. Yeah, I would definitely agree with what Joe was saying about the net zero commitments around the world. But I think I'm thinking of approaching this more from a public engagement perspective, because that's the area in which I work. I think in terms of public awareness, the change over the last 5 to 10 years has been quite rapid in the UK. So the organization that I work for instance, Climate Outreach, when that was founded, it was all about trying to get people to even talk about climate change and be aware that it's an issue that people should be thinking about. Particularly working with the centre right about, how do we speak to groups beyond, those who already care about climate change. To some extent, we're still doing that, but the sort of climate silence that was there and 5 to 10 years ago isn't as much of a thing now. I would say there's still work to be done. So there's still too many groups that are they don't feel like they have a place in the climate conversation. They don't feel like they have a place in the climate movement. And so definitely work to be done there. And I would say that it's, for instance, great that so many countries, including, really, the high emitting countries around the world have made net zero commitments, but the level of awareness of those commitments is quite low still. So then, for instance, in some of our work, we found that there are a lot of misconceptions about what other countries are doing and this feeling that the UK is going into it alone. And that's really something that can hold us back unless we really push that public engagement.
Thank you, Susie. That's really helpful. And yeah, you mentioned that a lot of groups and yeah, a lot of people feel that they actually can't engage with the environment movement, or for whatever reason there are barriers to accessing that. And I suppose, Lola, from your perspective, from the youth climate movement, I think the youth climate movement has been a huge voice and has done amazing work, but it's perhaps come from a place where youth felt that they weren't being heard. So yeah, do you have any thoughts or comments on that, and perhaps from that youth movement perspective, like how we're doing and where we're at?
Yeah, sure. Before I go into that, I just the last thing that Susie said, I know you said we're going to come on to this more later, so I'll keep it brief, but I find it really interesting that with positive messaging, in a more specific sense, as in terms of like from the government, kind of the perception, like this kind of like world leader narrative, which is that like the UK is doing really great, it's a world leader, we're fine kind of thing. I just find it interesting, the idea that like that on one hand, reduces the perception of what kind of commitments are needed, but then also the idea that it could conversely make people think that we're not being joined. And so there's like two different elements of how that kind of message could be negative. But going on to like my focus, which is obviously like organizing and particularly youth organizing, I think there is definitely a lot of cause for hope. There is, not everything has been perfect or even good by any means, but I sometimes feel like as a youth movement, Decent hasn't really given itself enough credit, or really had an internal understanding of the level of influence we've been able to have on the public understanding of climate and on where the conversation has shifted to. And that's been a really positive thing. Internally, the organization of the movement space has been quite, it's morphed a lot, especially with COP26, that obviously had a major impact on kind of what the movement space looked like and how it oriented itself. And the fact that COP26 obviously ended up being delayed meant that there was kind of like I think this kind of delayed limbo almost, where it was like everything was about COP, like things are called COP, and then that ends up going from like 1 year of organizing to like 2 years. And it kind of changed the way that we were able to work for that period of time. But I think that there has been a lot of really positive work that's been done, particularly in terms of shifting the focus of like different types of organizing. So I'm kind of talking about how do we engage people who aren't already like super engaged on climate. And I think that's something which we've definitely been working towards in terms of a lot of different organizations that are popping up, which are doing deep organizing work, community organizing, really trying to develop the capacity, one of developing the capacity of communities to think about climate and how it affects them on a local level and what change should actually look like, not just in terms of on a national level, but in terms of every level of change and every level of power that can be lobbied and worked on. And then also how that like capacity is developed by the building and molding of leaders and organizers who can train others and be trained and do the work of critical education through through autonomy and being given skills to be able to create change. Organizations like Pay for the Future, obviously, which do incredible work like that on the in terms of MPs, so obviously local, but more on like the national administration level. So I feel like there is definitely cause for a lot of hope in terms of where movement space is going, and it's obviously difficult to say, and like I don't want to make predictions, but I do think that I personally have a lot of hope, and I feel like a lot of positive work is being done. Hopefully it will continue to flourish and have some kind of effect, even if it doesn't feel like it always does.
Great, thank you, Lola. So our next question is a bit more framed around that kind of positive messaging that we might use. And the question is, how do you balance positivity with a sense of urgency when speaking to your friends, family, colleagues about climate change? And as our communications expert, Susie, perhaps we could come to you first on that one.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Good question. Yeah, I think, well, often when people think about climate change, at least from sort of the research that I've done, what we found is that the things that come to mind tend to be very negative. The devastating impacts of what people talk about, extreme weather events, and in some cases this can help to motivate action in terms of making climate change sort of driving that sense of urgency. But at the same time, for some people, it can also erode a sense of agency. So it can make people feel like they can't do anything about it. They feel helpless. And I completely agree with the need to balance both of these things. We kind of need more of both, and to make sure that, the work that we've been doing at Climate Outreach, we talk about giving people a sense of efficacy and hope, similar to what Lola was saying about action at different levels. People want to make a difference. They feel proud and they feel good when they do things to help the environment. And talking about, for instance, the role that we as individuals can have, not only in doing things in our personal lives, but also in driving change at different levels, at sort of making sure that the government knows that we want them to facilitate change so that people can live more low carbon lifestyles, for instance, that we drive change in our communities and our social groups. these actions, these particularly collective actions, can be really powerful in giving people a sense that they can do something about climate change, because then, I think Lola also mentioned this earlier, you don't feel like it's just you're acting together as a collective, and that collective sense of power is really it can be quite incredible. I think in terms of our audience research, for those who haven't come across our resource, Britain Talks Climate, it's we talk about how 7 different groups in Britain have quite distinctive ways of approaching lots of different issues in society, and climate change is one of them. And while there are lots of areas of common ground, there are some differences. So, for instance, some groups are particularly motivated and want to hear a positive story or need to hear a positive story. And these are groups, for instance, that one example is a group that is quite moderate and left, but not politically active. They feel like they can't make political change, that politicians don't care about people like them, but they really try their best to do what they can in their daily lives, and they feel motivated by sort of wanting to do right by their family and by their kids. And there's a challenge, but also an opportunity here to build their sense of being able to do something about climate change, and that is really a space for, that's a particular space for messages of hope and positivity. Thanks.
That's great, thanks Susie. Yeah, so it's about the showing people that yes, it is an urgent situation, but you have agency to make change and you have the ability to make change. Thank you. And lots of praise for climate outreach in the chat as well. Joe, do you have any thoughts on how you balance positivity with urgency when speaking to your friends, family or colleagues?
Yeah, I try and refer to facts quite a lot, as I feel like it helps structure the arguments that I'm making. So rather than sort of almost taking the emotion out of it to a certain degree, but then to what extent do people trust facts? I don't know, maybe Susie would probably be able to talk a little bit more about that. But actually, I just want to reflect quickly on what Lola said about the sort of flip side to the UK saying it's a kind of world leader in climate action. I think that's a really important point, because actually it's almost hammering home this point that the rest of the world isn't doing anything. And I think in the Britain Talks climate research that Susie's been engaged with, actually when talking about that global perspective from a comms point of view, it's actually important to talk up the amount that the rest of the world is doing. And just to give one example, in terms of high emitters, I think in China last year they built I think 5 times the amount of offshore wind farms than the entire power demand of France in 1 year. So when you kind of take those things together and you sort of paint that picture for people of what's actually going on out there in terms of action on climate change on a global scale, I think it probably is quite reassuring for people in Britain who are thinking we're going it alone, but actually, huge economies like China are getting on board with this and delivering action, which is going to make a real difference, because it's not just a UK problem, it's a global challenge that we've all got to face. So just wanted to kind of knit those 2 points together. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, really helpful. Thanks, Joe. And Susie, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that kind of facts or, or stories, as we were talking about earlier. Do people trust facts? Do people listen to that?
To some extent, it's a bit, facts to some extent can help. And especially if you're talking to your friends and your family, you're likely to be someone that, they trust. And therefore your facts coming from you will mean a lot. I think where we run into difficulty is if we're talking to people that are not like us, that believe differently. And in that case, it can be easier to take a step back and try and find some common ground in terms of people's values and, hopes and sort of establish that foundation for trust.
That's really helpful. So trust first, facts second. Fantastic. Our next couple of questions are around the role of people power and empowering democratic engagement, which is what Hope for the Future is all about. It's about giving people that platform to have their say and speak to politicians about climate change. So our audience submitted question is, how do we ensure that those campaigning on climate change still have a voice when we consider, for example, the recent policing bill, which I'm sure, as we all know, has put in greater regulation around protests and our right to protest. So Lola, as a, again, coming from your kind of organising background, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think where do I want to start? I think it's quite interesting in terms of with the question about the general question about what reasons there are to be hopeful. I feel like in the context of, seeing the government response to the campaigning that's been happening over the last couple of years on climate, but also on racial justice and other issues, which are all obviously linked. And these protests, the way that they've responded, as we know, has been extremely harsh and draconian and anti-democratic, and has an effect on a number of different groups, and it will have a really, obviously we know it will have a really negative impact on campaigning and on the ability of campaigners to do work. I think when we look at the actual, when you break down like the specifics of what kind of things being proposed in the bill, I think it has really interesting insights and considerations for why we might want to have hope in this political moment that we're in, because what we see is that this bill is a very, the sense in which this bill is a response to recent protests is very direct. It in the particular addresses particular things that have happened at particular protests over the last couple of years that the government doesn't like. And the fact that there are things that have happened at particular protests over the last couple of years that have pushed the government into a position where they feel like they need to respond in this way is something that's important. If, protests had no impact on anyone, it didn't do anything, why would the government have any reason to, put things in a bill about statues, or put things in a bill which are clearly specifically a response to actions that Extinction Rebellion have done, or that climate strikers have done, talking about, how you can do action on Parliament Square. These are such specific things, and what they demonstrate is that we are doing something that is not liked, and that means it has some kind of impact. And this is something that the government wanted to get through before a recess. They thought they could just get it through and then we'll go home. And it really did not, the public did not respond to it in the way that they thought they were going to at all. And so I think that even though there are difficult conditions, and what we're dealing with is, the impacts of it really can't be overstated. It's really disastrous. It's important that we understand as well the conditions that mean that this is something which has been generated are actually, in a kind of strange way, almost hopeful, at least for me.
That's a really good point and a really interesting perspective on it. And I suppose, like you mentioned about the kind of backlash and the noise that came out against it as well, and actually as it's sort of ping-ponging through Parliament, it has been watered down and there have been things taken out of it from the House of Lords. So I suppose, that's another example of how that kind of collective voice can make those changes and really have an impact in Parliament and on policy. Joe, do you have any thoughts on this? So as a reminder, the original question was, how do we ensure that those campaigning on climate change still have a voice when we consider, for example, the recent policing bill?
Yeah, thanks. So first of all, I was actually working in Parliament, just off Parliament Square, when the Extinction Rebellion protests were going on. I think it was in 2019 when there was sort of weeks of protest. And I know that the the bill currently going through Parliament at the moment, there was stuff on it about where you can protest and the noise and stuff like that. And I do remember sort of at the time thinking, God, who are these noisy people outside? But actually from an MP's point of view in Parliament, it's like, who is actually outside in Parliament Square protesting? What are they protesting about? And it's a really important function of our democracy that people are allowed to do that and bring to attention directly, to the people about what's actually going on, not relying on filters, whether it's the media or their staff or whatever, to actually be able to see what's going on, whether it's in their constituency, like great work that I hope for the future and others do, whether it's in the email inbox, 38 Degrees, Friends of the Earth, lots of other great campaigning organisations out there who are contacting MPs on a daily basis. And obviously, it's really important that the public do engage because it provides what's called the sort of Overton window. It pushes it along. It allows MPs to kind of follow in behind these protests and that call for action, actually, put forward legislation. So the climate emergency was declared, I think, in 2019 following the Extinction Rebellion protests. So it was to an extent quite effective. And then net zero was put into law as well. So perhaps the government's quite annoyed at the fact that it was forced into this position and is kind of rebelling against that to some degree. So yeah, I think that's kind of where I come from on all of this. I think the protest is incredibly important, particularly around the environment and climate change, and it makes things possible for politicians if they can see that public motivation, that public concern. It means that we can act faster. So it's really important that we protect that.
Great, thanks, Joe. And our next question from the pre-submitted questions is about how we can better link up campaign groups, think tanks, researchers, etc. with one another to ensure that we're maximising our efforts and impact. So we've obviously talked quite a bit about the kind of collective voice, but how do we make sure those different groups are all connected and lined up to be having the greatest impact? So Susie, maybe as your link between research and also public engagement, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, tough one. I think that, I completely agree with the premise, and as Climate Outreach, we work with all kinds of organizations and individuals, from activist organizations to organizations like Hope for the Future and Green Alliance. And I think those connections are really important because we all work in slightly different spaces and have, but we all have the same overarching goal. And yeah, I would say spaces like this are great for that. Convening events that bring together people from different backgrounds, super important. I think, yeah, personally, I would love to work more with organizations that work on the ground with different communities, because I think, that's where the real expertise lies, and it's so important to reach people where they're starting from. Yeah, thanks.
Great, thanks, Susie. Lola, what are your thoughts on that question?
I feel quite lucky with the experience that I've had in tackling this question in terms of engagement with different types of groups, particularly when I started in the climate strike. We were lucky to have the support of a lot of different think tanks and organizations and universities, trade unions, community groups, all sorts of different groups, and obviously NGOs. So I feel like, honestly, I don't feel like I'm the best person to ask questions, so I just had it quite easy. And now I do feel, I think maybe the reason why is because, especially in the work I do now, where which is mostly on campus organizing, we're not exactly, as of the cultural zeitgeist as we have the, half of the cultural zeitgeist on our side, like we did with the climate strike. But we've still been able to form a really broad coalition of people. And I think the reason that we're able to do that is because of the scale of the work that we do and the type of mapping that we're able to do. So we really try to identify as many of the different actors that we can in terms of the environment that we're working with, and then reach out to them. And this is something that was happening a lot in the run up to COP26, in terms of like mapping what is the state of the wider climate movement, and how can we bring these people together in coalition. And doing that is obviously easier when you're working on like a campaign, when you're working on campaigns which are taking place in like a campus, like a more concrete defined area. But that kind of work is extremely important when we're working across movements as well. And it takes, when we're talking about doing that kind of work across the entire movement, it just takes funding really, to have people who can interview, do research, identify, and so in a sense, creating the links between activists and researchers takes research of who those people are and what kind of work they're doing, I guess. So yeah.
Yeah, really good point. Thanks, Lola. Joe, do you have any thoughts on this?
I was just thinking when Lola mentioned COP26 that we actually did an event in the Green Zone at COP26 in Glasgow, the Environment APPG, along with lots of other consensus groups in Parliament. And that was just fantastic because we had 3 hours at the event officially, and it was a sort of public space where people could come and engage. So we had lots of students up there coming to watch debates and events, and there was a real sense of public engagement and enjoyment and interaction, listening to parliamentarians, decision makers. We had a big long Q&A session with parliamentarians, which I think is really important, so that people could put across their views. So we had that, and we also had it live streamed as well across the world on the COP26 YouTube channel. And again, I think in terms of technology, I think that's the real game changer for engagement, because it means that all of us can connect a lot more easily. I mean, we're doing this on Zoom right now from Sheffield and London and basically all over the world. We've got people from the USA and Germany and Denmark on this call today. So it just shows you the power of technology and the fact that, in terms of public engagement and convening, that can be a really useful tool for us, connecting with researchers, with think tanks and sort of activists on the ground, with parliamentarians too. And one thing that I forgot to say earlier is that if you ask any MP what they get asked about most in their email inbox, or what they get asked to do or to take action on, it's always bees and pesticides. So that is a little tidbit of information for you. Whether it's 38 degrees or others, but their inboxes are full of emails asking them to act on pesticides and on the environment.
That is an interesting tidbit. Thanks, Joe, for letting us know. Yeah, great. That's really interesting to hear. And I suppose from Hope for the Future's perspective, we're running some events this year with the aim of engaging kind of those across those different sectors. So with business, parliamentarians, local groups, I mean, we'll see how it goes. We're really hopeful that we'll be able to bring them all together through kind of different activities and that sort of thing. So it will be interesting. So we're drawing to the end of our event this evening. So I'd love to come to each of our speakers with a kind of a final question, and if you could maybe just speak for a couple of minutes each. And that's just from everything that we've discussed today, and from what you've heard from your fellow speakers, is to answer the question: do you think that there are reasons to be hopeful in a climate crisis? And maybe just kind of wrapping up some of the thoughts and the contributions that you've made. And so I'll come to Lola, Joe, then Susie.
Yeah, so I think it's obvious what my position is, but I do feel like there is reason to have hope. I think something that was an interesting thing that came up in the conversation was about how we can communicate about having hope, and like what does that look like, and I do think that does come down in terms of, I do media and that kind of speaking to like lots of different people at once. And I think that when we are trying to do that, I think that, as Susie was saying, like stories really help us, and telling the story of what change can look like and how people can be a part of it. And I think that is ultimately a positive one. And sometimes that does include all of the different emotions that people were talking about before. And Joe, I think you mentioned that frustration was one that you picked up on that was there. And I think that rather than seeing, you know, frustration as something which is opposed to or like comes in the way of hope and believing in change, it is hope that allows us to feel frustrated. It's hope that comes from us being frustrated. If we don't believe that something can change, there's no reason for us to feel frustrated about the fact that it isn't something else. We have to believe that things can be different if we're frustrated about the fact that they aren't. And it's important that we remember that this is, I don't feel like it's my place to give up. I really don't. I don't feel like it's my decision, because as I said, we're part of the collective, and I feel like I owe it to other people. I owe it to the people that I campaign with, that I organize with, the people that I know, the people that I love, to try and do something. And it's that keeps me going, rather than the vision of what, you know, like, you know, post-apocalyptic world could be. It's understanding that we can build something that is new and that progress of some sort is being made. And I think that if we hold on to that, it allows us to do work which is, in terms of from an organizing perspective, which is sustainable and more healthy for us as individuals who care about the climate. So yeah.
Great, thanks Lola, really well put. Joe?
I don't think I can top that. That was absolutely amazing. And also bringing in the fact that I felt frustrated, it's because of the hope that I feel. And I think that's absolutely right. It's I think if we didn't feel hope, well, we've got no option but to feel hope. We wouldn't be here. There'd be no point, would we? We just give up. If it was hopeless, it was a hopeless ambition or aim, then I don't think any of us would be here today. So we've got to maintain that hope. We've got to be realistic. We've got to be persistent. We've got to be strategic and clever. And yeah, and I think we've just got to keep motivated. We've got such a responsibility. I think it sort of brings it neatly back to what we were saying at the start about the sort of privileged position that some of us are in, doing research and activism and politics, is that we do feel that responsibility. And we know that the solutions are out there. We've seen them, we've listened to them, and we need to communicate them. And yeah, let's keep doing it.
Thanks, Joe. And Susie?
Yeah, both amazing responses. I think, yeah, I mean, my reflection on this is that there's simultaneously nothing better and nothing worse than working for climate anxiety and working in this space and doing work in this space. You know, you're so close to all of the news and the terrible things, but at the same time, there's nothing better for it than to do something about it and join a group, join a community. And of course, it's understandable that people feel helpless. You know, I do as well. It's an overwhelming topic. And it involves, you know, the whole world, how we live, how we travel. But at the same time, I think, well, research has shown there's a project called The Good Life 2030, I think, that has looked into sort of positive stories about what people want, what people see as a good life. And that is largely the same, you know. So people want to be able to enjoy nature with their family and friends, to feel more connected to their communities. And these positive stories are essential and central to what we can tell about climate change.
Fantastic, thank you, Susie. Brilliant. Well, we are now coming to the end of our event, and I just want to say a huge thank you to our speakers this evening, and thank you also to everyone who's attended and everyone who's been contributing to the chat. It's great to hear that some of you've really enjoyed it and heard some different perspectives and insights, and a huge thank you as well to the Festival of Debate for for working with us to put on this event. As I mentioned at the beginning, I just want to mention again that Hope for the Future does have our Green Match Fund happening this week, so please do donate if you're able to. All donations will be doubled, and Alice has just shared the link in the chat again. We're also going to share a feedback form, and we'd love to hear your feedback on the event, what you enjoyed, what you felt we could have done differently. It's always really useful to get your feedback on that. And I think Joe earlier in the chat shared a link to the Festival of Debate schedule as well. So, and as he mentioned, they've got Gloria Steinem joining for a talk later, so I'm sure that'll be really interesting. That's online, and they've got a really great lineup for the rest of the festival as well. So just to close, as I say, a huge thank you to all our speakers. We've had some really interesting thoughts and perspectives. I loved Lola's quote there of, you know, I don't feel like it's my place to give up. I think that's really, really powerful and such a good way to think about it. We've heard that, you know, we do have the power to make change. And I think that is the key to us feeling hopeful about this climate crisis. We do have the power to make change and to actually make a difference. And also another key theme has been that hope is built through being together in a collective. And although we're online this evening, I hope that we've all felt, you know, we've been here together and just talking about the hope and the action that we can make on climate change. So I hope that I'm using the word hope too much, but I hope it has generated some hope and that we're all leaving this evening feeling re-energized and ready to go out and make change in this world. So thank you again, everyone. Hope you have a wonderful evening. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.